welcome back. Now, National Treasury has allocated a total of 36 billion rand to fund all the latest social relief measures that were announced by government to deal with the impact of COVID-19 and also the recent social unrest that engulfed parts of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. Now, this move has received mixed reaction from labor unions, economists, and, of course, civil society groupings. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni also gave an update on the estimated cost of damages to the properties that were destroyed during the recent riots in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. Now, the Finance Minister says that the South African Risk Insurance Association, SASRIA, may have to pay between 15 and 20 billion rand in claims. And to get some more analysis on what was announced by the Finance Minister, we're joined by Ndumiso Hadebe, who's an economist at KH Research Equity Partners, and Isobel Frye, Director of Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Thanks so much to both of you, and welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you so much for having us, Sakina.
Thank you.
Ndumiso, let me start with you. So Minister Tito Mboweni says that National Treasury has reprioritized a total of 36.1 billion rand to fund all of these social relief measures. But let's just start by understanding what do we mean by reprioritizing?
So a reprioritization, similarly to what National Treasury has done before, it's really a reprioritization of fiscal allocation based on existing resources. But additionally, in this case, we've also seen that there have been higher than expected tax receipts, specifically owing to the uptick in commodity prices that South Africa became a beneficiary of, which then recorded a better than expected revenue collection on the side of the National Revenue Collector in this instance. And as a consequence, they were able then to make a provision of a reprioritization of this fiscal resources to be able to provide some kind of social assistance in relation to the social unrest that we've seen over the past 2 to 3 weeks in South Africa, but as well as part of the broader response and support that is required as a result of the adverse effects of the pandemic on the South African economy and, of course, on South African households.
And of course, looking at all of this, Isobel, there's almost an involuntary response to want to ask, where is the money going to come from? Do we have the funds in the fiscus to fund all of this? Is that an appropriate question? Do you think it's even a worthwhile question at a time like this?
Thanks, Sakina, and good morning to everybody. You're touching on a very interesting, quite a tricky area, because we know that in the Constitution, the state is obliged to make maximum available resources to programs that meet people's basic needs. So the question is, do we get transparency into those availability of resources? I remember back in 2002 when a basic income grant was first mooted, and we were told, even though the state was recording budget surplus, that there wasn't enough money. So the not enough money is a constant refrain every time we seem to be pushing for increased state expenditure on the well-being of people. To an extent, we were told that the social relief of distress had to end in April because there was no more money. Then we discover that actually in March, government was sitting on about 292 billion, and that now there is money available for an expanded social relief of distress. Now, of course, it's government's prerogative to be the keepers of the purse and to be the final deciders on how the money is allocated. To an extent, however, it feels as if we're not being given the true facts. So not to sound like conspiracy theory, we do need to know how much is available so that there can be forward planning around these things. We know, for instance, that the current social relief of distress program is slated to end in March next year. So we're going to go through the same cycle of saying people's needs need to be met. We want to avoid the kinds of instability that we've seen in recent weeks, that we see the consequence of money not spent through social relief of distress. We can only ask, could the damage have been lessened if people were still feeling that they were being recognized and the 350 was being paid? So to an extent, it doesn't feel as if we're playing on a level playing field. And I think that that's a conversation going forward in coming days and weeks that we really should be having.
And speaking of this reintroduction of the social grant for relief of distress, Isobel, in that, as you rightly point out, it was questioned as to why did government stop that, given that we were still in the grips of a pandemic. We are still in the grips of a pandemic. But also concerns have been raised about the sustainability of this on the one hand, but on the other hand, whether it is even sufficient at this point, given all the talk around inequality. And perhaps it is worthwhile just looking at the statistics and the numbers around inequality in the country, Isobel.
Thanks, Sakina. Your point, again, opens another new area that we at my institute are really looking into, and that is the question of the adequacy of the response. So we know in South Africa that our income inequality is an outlier at 0.6 in Gini coefficient. The US is about 0.4. But we also know that wealth, accumulated wealth in South Africa, takes us to 0.9. So 1 being complete inequality, 0.9 shows in itself that the distribution in this country is completely unequal and raises questions as to how we start to normalize and to equalize what many call idle wealth. We are aware that in a recession, income is not the best form of taxation. So given that we want to look at how we can stabilize, that's one issue. I do want to come back to the question of the sustainability. Much of our modeling on the value of the social relief of distress grant or a basic income grant going forward asks the question, how big does a grant need to be in order to meet the purpose for which it's designed? Now, I was having a discussion with someone about this morning. The social relief of distress is a humanitarian response. At 350 Rand, it's basically 60% of the food poverty line. And the food poverty line is basically, and I quote, enough to afford enough food to meet the minimum daily requirements needed to survive. So we're not giving people any surplus. Our expectations are that through distribution, you can generate surplus, and so people can then start demanding and generating a bottom-up demand. Instead of a kind of a government program supply side. What we are very concerned about is that at the price tag of 26.7 billion Rand, the state's going to be spending money on a program, and at the end of the day, through the evaluation, is expected to ask, what did we get for this money? We don't think that at the amount of 350 Rand, which is not even the survivalist food poverty line, we're giving enough. In a way, it's almost as if you have to be much bigger in order to succeed at what you're trying to achieve. And too frequently, I think we try to achieve too much through broad, blunt policy instruments. So, I mean, I just look at the extended public works. We want that to create jobs, to do training, and to provide social protection. And yet it's too mean. We really, at this stage, recognizing the boldness that the state has demonstrated in rolling out the social relief of distress, we need to say, can we look at what we want to achieve going forward, and can we allocate enough? Because going back to my opening kind of comments, it is clear that if there is a will, we'll find a way to find the money.
So, Ndumiso, in April last year, government announced a major fiscal relief package of around 500 billion Rand that was supposed to include more than 30 billion for health and other frontline services. Then you had also to support vulnerable households, which came in excess of 50 billion Rand, another 40 billion, give or take, for wage protection through UIF, and around another 100 billion Rand for job creation initiatives. And then in the same year, you also have the Auditor General's report that tells us how these funds were spent and reveals the many flaws and corruption and maladministration that went on in the distribution of some of these funds. So let's talk about that, because it seems as though we have all of these figures being thrown at us, and we're not even talking about millions. We're now talking billions. And soon, I suspect, we'll be talking trillions. And it's kind of difficult to keep track of all these figures that are being thrown at us. So do you have a clearer indication for us at this stage of exactly what is being spent and how? Because we talk about these amounts and whether they are adequate, whether they're sufficient. But are we keeping sufficient track of the money that is being spent at the moment?
Indeed, Sakine. I think a lot of the challenges that we then associated with the interventions that come on the side of government face the difficulty of governance. And then in this instance, we see that even when you find instances where indigent grants are dispersed for the beneficiaries that are intended to benefit from such a grant. In certain instances, there are misstatements from a financial statement point of view to be able to report effectively as to whether or not the right beneficiaries did indeed receive this particular intervention. And I think to Isobel's point, it's quite correct because these interventions are indeed founded within the Constitution. Of course, we've seen, of course, in the Chapter 2 of the Constitution with the Bill of Rights, and of course, in relation to the disbursement of indigent grants, and as well, according to the Social Assistance Act as well of 2006. So these are some of the enabling legislations that permit for government to be able to do so. But of course, again, one of the, I would say, chronic challenges South Africa faces is not just fiscal constraints, as it were, as it is often cited. But one of the key challenges that is then faced is whether or not the fiscal allocation do indeed reach the intended beneficiaries that are supposed to benefit from this. And I would venture to say that it's important not just to measure government responses based on the intentions of the interventions that are put together, but based on the outcomes. And what we know about outcomes is that specifically, yes, we know what the lagging indicators look like in terms of South Africa's macroeconomic performance or even socioeconomic performance. But when we look at some of the leading indicators for the future, especially if you want to be an advanced economy, one that is inclusive and is able to provide opportunity for all, we see that even from a child poverty perspective, where we look at child multidimensional poverty, we can note that out of 10 children, 6 of those are suffering from multidimensional poverty. And this is when we look at it through the lens of health, nutrition, education, information, access to water and sanitation. And this is of particular importance because children are not necessarily bearers of the household purse. They are beneficiaries of extended support from guardians or parents, as it were. And this is indicative as to whether or not the head of those households are economically active. One, but of course, we know that there's a strong bond between some level of educational attainment with being economically active. Now, that speaks to whether or not the intended interventionist supply-side policies have the intended outcomes, as it were. And so that's why I think it's important not to necessarily measure the impact of interventions based on intentions, but rather based on outcomes. And I think that would bring us closer to the kind of solutions that we need in South Africa, because there's somewhat of a tendency to have a view, even with the package of the 500 billion that was allocated last year, to design some of these solutions for what is intended to be somewhat of a first world country. A case in point would be the guaranteed loan scheme on the side of government, to say that there's a certain criteria for folks who can benefit from the loan scheme, the guaranteed loan scheme, and I would underscore guaranteed loan scheme in this instance, for businesses that require that support. And of course, when businesses would go for applications for that support, you find that most of them can't necessarily even qualify for that particular support. Then you ask yourself, what is a guaranteed loan scheme simplistically from a layman's point of view? And if it is indeed guaranteed, why are there such high barriers to be able to access that support? And of course, you also know that there's an informal economy that is quite important in the South African setup, where a lot of survivalist entrepreneurs are surviving from being able to buy a bag of potatoes, repackaging those potatoes into smaller packages and selling them for 5 rand, and being able to use proceeds of those sales to be able to purchase milli meal and so on and so forth. So it would appear to me that sometimes in policy formulation and even in the design of interventions, it's almost as if we're stuck in our offices, or whoever is designing them does not even interact with entrepreneurs, because an entrepreneur would have quickly told them that that intervention is definitely not going to work because this is the texture and the scenarios that entrepreneurs are faced with. So it's quite important to be able to look at the interventions that are being proposed against the backdrop of the outcomes and the results that we're presently faced with in the South African context. And I think that will bring that realism in terms of its implementation. On the latter point, Sakina, on the question of implementation, it appears to me that there's a concerted need to be able to ensure that fiscal allocations and resources do certainly indeed reach the intended beneficiaries. And what does this mean? This means that there needs to be enhanced governance, especially at the level of local government, because that's effectively where a lot of indigent grants are indeed dispersed. Secondly, when we talk about investment of entrepreneurship, that is actually where economic activity happens. It happens at the level of local government. And now when you have a situation where a possible investor or you and I, Sakina, wants to start up shop in a specific area and we're unable to get certain bills in respect of that, or able to get the requisite bylaws or experience efficiencies where that is concerned, that deters investment. And of course, when we look at what the number that we refer to as the gross fixed capital formation number, that is the number that gives us an indication as to the level of commitment that people are invested in the South African economy. That number continues to be somewhat muted simply because of some of these underlying issues. And we see it in the results that come out in terms of South Africa's macroeconomic performance, but also the socio-economic instability that then induces scenarios that we've seen over the past 2 weeks.
We're out of time, but Isobel, very briefly, in a minute or less, when the finance minister says that government will not borrow in order to basically fund what is needed, and the measures or the funding in place should be sufficient. How does this affect the easing of poverty and inequality? Do you think the measures that were announced by the finance minister are enough to go at least some ways to easing that?
Thanks, Sakina. I think that the measures were welcome. I don't think that they went far enough. I think the fact that the minister termed this a consumption grant shows exactly how narrow their thinking is about the possibility of, as Ndumiso said, avoiding the concern of misspend. If you give money into the hands and the pockets of the poor in households across the country, you have a stimulus shock, which will enable things to start working from the bottom rather than wait for the trickle down from the top. The question of affordability, we've seen that it depends on where people are looking and to the extent to which they want to look. Borrowing from the Reserve Bank is at a much lower rate than borrowing from private investors. We think that there's a huge amount of conversation that needs to happen to unpack these things. We don't want government to react in a defensive way. We're all in this together, and that's what the last 2 weeks have shown us, have reminded us, especially in the enclaves of middle class, where, for instance, you're not faced with the daily realities of the starvation. As Ndumiso was saying, we are raising children who are malnourished, who are stunted mentally as well as physically. They're the future. They're the people on whose shoulders this country's development lies. And if we're not able to make sure that they have sufficient for cognitive brain ability and development, let alone mental health and psyche and well-being, then I'm not sure what the function of our constitution and our democracy is.
Well, on that sobering note, we have to leave it, Isobel. And thank you so much to both Isobel Frye and Ndumiso Hadebe. Ndumiso is an economist at KH Research Equity Partners, and Isobel Frye, Director of Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, giving their reactions to the Department of to the Treasury announcing a 36.1 billion rand social relief fund that was announced by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni yesterday. Whew.
That's where we leave.